Hello and welcome to this Comms First session, your everyday guide to Microsoft 365 groups. This session will be presented by Matthew Wade. Hello, Matthew.
Thanks very much, Mark. As Mark said, tonight we're going to be talking about Microsoft 365 groups, sometimes one of the most confusing aspects of the Microsoft 365 system. First, I just want to say a very hearty thank you to all of the sponsors for this conference. I have to say I speak at a lot of conferences these days, and especially after COVID hit in March, a number of them were canceled or brought online. I have not seen an outpouring of support even anywhere close to this, so I'm really impressed both by the team that put together Commsverse, but also by the sponsors who have helped out. So make sure to check them out. Go look at the sponsor booths in Microsoft Teams, and definitely take a look at some of the resources out there. A lot of opportunities, a lot of cool things ahead of you. So my name is Matt Wade. Good evening from upstate New York. I live about 2.5 hours by train or car north of New York City. Pretty much I'm a consultant on the Microsoft 365, Office 365, Azure stacks. I am the co-founder of Jump to 365, which is the home base for the periodic table of Office 365. So if this looks familiar above my shoulder, that's what I'm referring to. If it doesn't, no big deal. You'll see a little bit more about that during this session. Feel free to follow me on Twitter or LinkedIn. I share a lot of updates, news, and information about Microsoft 365, O365, and also put out a bunch of resources, especially on the user level side of things. I'm very much on the adoption, change management, and just helping people get more out of the systems that they've already invested in. And that's one of the reasons why we're going to talk today about groups within Office 365, now known as the Microsoft 365 groups, even though the system itself is still known as Office 365 for the most part. We're actually going to talk a little bit about the brand confusion in a little bit. And we're going to specifically talk about how these groups are going to be surfacing in Outlook, Yammer, and Teams, and how they interact and how they sometimes don't interact. So I'm going to jump right in. But I do want to give a quick heads up. If you have a question, by all means, you'll see a Q&A option within the within this experience here through the live event in Microsoft Teams. Feel free to drop your questions in whenever you would like. I'm going to go back to Teams every so often and check it out. Now you can probably notice that PowerPoint has taken over my screen in this case. So I don't have direct access to Teams at all points, but I will go back. And also keep in mind that live events are delayed 15 to 60 seconds. So they won't be actually live full on, so or real time. So I will definitely try to answer your questions along the way, and I'll leave a few minutes at the end for questions as well. So jumping right in, a little bit of background here for even using Microsoft 365 groups. First thing you're definitely going to need is, well, step 0, let's say, is to be on Office 365, to have licenses and to have access to it. Really important is you need to make sure that you have SharePoint Online licenses provided to all of your group members. If you don't, there's no file repository associated with that group, which is a problem. Similarly, you have to have Exchange Online licenses at least applied to the group itself, not necessarily to the members. You can do a hybrid scenario where Exchange On-Prem is where you're hosting the local users, but you still have to have Exchange Online inboxes and calendars for the group itself. So keep that in mind. Another thing is that US government community cloud GCC tenants do not have access to Yammer, probably won't ever have access to Yammer, although don't quote me on that. And for the most part, a lot of features that are available right now in the commercial side, let's say the enterprise education, those types of license types, GCC does not have those. So if I do mention something that to you sounds off base or you've never heard about before, it might be, especially if you're on GCC, it might be because it's not available yet, or it's just not even coming to GCC. And the last is if you work in the IT department, you oversee administration of Office 365. It's really important to keep abreast on all the stuff that's happening within this platform because it changes all the time, sometimes without any warning. The roadmaps, the blogs, all that stuff is great, but a lot of times you'll just see things that change and you just don't have a reason for it. So some things to keep in mind as you're going to move forward here. Another precursor to the actual content for tonight is going to be a couple of fair warnings on how groups work. First, groups are confusing. Group aspects are being developed by different teams at Microsoft, and sometimes they aren't talking to each other the way that we would potentially hope that they would. Sometimes features are rolled out without consideration or not enough consideration to the impacts of other features. And because of that, documentation can be done by different groups. Sometimes there's not review across organizations, and that's just human nature, right? That's just how businesses work sometimes, especially in an organization that's as large as Microsoft. So don't feel bad if you think that groups are confusing, because they are. Just to get the research done to put together a presentation like this took me dozens of hours to confirm the citations, the sources, all of the people behind the scenes that could confirm this information. So just know that what I put together is generally accurate, but you want to make sure you go out and confirm some of this stuff for yourself. And if you're confused along the way, don't feel too bad, because so are the rest of us. Another is terminology. The word group, the word team, a couple others within the Office 365 sphere, they've effectively been stolen from us in the English language, because you can't really verbally say or orally say the word group, and your audience doesn't necessarily know if you mean like the big G group, meaning like the actual Microsoft 365 group, or a group little g as in like a collection of people. Same with the word team. If you look through my slides here, you will notice that I always capitalize group or team if I'm talking about the specific Microsoft aspect of it, and I will not capitalize it, or I'll try to use a different word if possible when I'm talking about the general English word. Try to do that yourself, because it can otherwise be very confusing if you don't stick to a common and consistent terminology. And lastly, for the sort of heads up, is this mindset that I see a lot of times, sometimes coming from folks at Microsoft itself, is that groups are groups are groups. And that concept is supposed to push the idea of if you're talking about a Microsoft 365 group, all groups are created equal, they're all the same, they all do the same thing, and they all have the same type of experience from the user end, or maybe more so from the admin side. I think that that is patently false, and I'm going to, be pretty blunt about some of my opinions on how groups work throughout this session. And this is probably one of the big first ones, is that if somebody, or if you stumble across this whole argument of groups are groups are groups, that is not correct from the perspective of a user. It really depends on where you're going to create that group and what you want to do with that group. And all those experiences can be wildly different depending on the use case, the application of the tools, and especially where you're going to be creating that group from. So with that out of the way, let's talk about the agenda for the session today. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about Microsoft 365 versus Office 365. I want to get on the same page here so we're all level set before we even start talking about groups. From there, we'll talk about how groups work sort of in the background, what it means, what it is, and then we'll jump specifically into how groups work in Outlook, Teams, and Yammer. And yes, groups surface in other apps like SharePoint and like Planner, but we're going to talk a little bit about how those are sort of second level group connected apps. And after that, I'll run through some wrap up information, including providing a bunch of resources for you so you can kind of use these and bring them back to your organization. I have a bunch of infographics, a bunch of blog posts, and other links that you can take back, in addition to the slides themselves. So if you're watching live right now, I'll have a link at the end that you can actually download the slides. I have them uploaded as well to the central Commsverse download area. That's up to you and how you want to grab them. But I like to make my slides available in one central place on my website, so you can grab them whenever you'd like. So let's do that level setting now of what Microsoft 365 is. So until at least a few months ago, saying this now in July 2020, Microsoft 365 was essentially a three-tier suite of three different services. Office 365, so business productivity, Windows, so operating system, enterprise management and security being that third one, which most end users wouldn't really have any interaction with directly, other than say maybe Azure information or Microsoft information protection for classification, or maybe data loss prevention for DLP. But generally speaking, this was sort of a three-pronged experience. Since then, we've had some changes. So a few months ago, Microsoft 365 has sort of changed its concept, especially on the consumer side of things. So the free version, or sorry, the home version of Office 365 basically became Microsoft 365, and so did the business versions of that. So these would be the licenses that are below Enterprise E, or Education A, or Government G, or First Line F. Those licenses have sort of become now this Microsoft 365 Business Basic, Business Standard, Business Premium, and Office 365 Pro Plus, which is basically the installable version of Office as we've known it now since probably the 90s, is now called Microsoft 365 Apps. That being said, the term is still Office 365 for enterprise, government, first line, and education. That's kind of a big deal because right now we're sort of in an inconsistent branding situation, which, to be frank, is not really uncommon within this field. I think that makes our jobs a little bit harder sometimes. But just know that the terminology here, when I say Microsoft 365 group, that terminology is being dictated. It is clear that a group is a Microsoft 365 group, even if you have an Office 365 license like an E3 or a G5 or an A1. And that doesn't matter regardless of what license you have. Eventually, I'm sure those E, A, G, and Fs will become Microsoft 365 licenses, but for the time being, they're still O365. So if you hear somebody say Office 365 group, they're probably not wrong. They're just using terminology that's only slightly outdated, and eventually they'll probably catch on and go from there. So level setting we've done on what the Microsoft 365 brand means. Let's talk about Microsoft 365 groups. So groups, if you hear from Microsoft itself, will say very simply, groups is a membership service. Great. On a technical level, that's absolutely correct. From a real world standpoint of how people actually interact with Office these days, it is absolutely irrelevant. The way people interact with Office 365 apps or Microsoft 365 apps is through membership, sure, but that's sort of just part of it. It's really just like, okay, great. Yep, we know that there's permissions applied here. That's not really a big deal. It keeps people in and keeps people out, but it's sort of a foundational thing. I don't have to think about that because I'm going to use the apps every day, regardless of who's in that group. The group can be managed either by IT or by a local person within the organization, but it's really that owner's job to manage the membership, and I don't have to think about that. So from the everyday level, it's really an online workspace for specific people. So that specific collection of individuals who are working on a project together or happen to be in a business unit together or in a classroom together, all of that stuff is what's being provided as the user experience from a viewpoint of getting stuff done. The membership service aspect of it, while technically accurate, is practically unnecessary, unrecognizable to the everyday user. So when you do create a group, all groups within Microsoft 365 or Office 365 have the same basic building blocks. The first is going to be a communication method, a place to converse. Next is going to be a place to store all of your files and documents and any sort of repos that you need to upload and have accessible from the cloud. The third is going to be a method for tracking, and the last is going to be a central note-taking space. And that makes sense because every team, every group of people with a goal really has 4 basic needs at least, and that's going to be a way to talk, a place to keep stuff, a method of tracking, and a historical record. So let's talk about that first one because that's actually really the first step of going into Microsoft 365 groups, is a way to talk to people. There's 3 ways to do it within Office 365, and that's going to be email, chat, or a social feed. And of course, it's quite easy at this point for you to make the connections here to Outlook, to Teams, and to Yammer. And the important aspect here is that the online workspace that comes with these tools is going to be specific to that application. There are some connections between groups created in each of these apps, but there are some that just have 0 connection whatsoever. So the online workspace is going to come with each of these apps, have specific names, and I'm going to keep this terminology specific throughout the session. I think these are generally considered, the directed terms that Microsoft would use, but if not, forgive me on that one, I guess. But the first is going to be Outlook groups. Any group that's created through Outlook is going to be an Outlook group. Any group created in Microsoft Teams is going to be a team. And any group created in Yammer is going to be a community. And the way that these interact is very important. So this infographic here is probably going to be the biggest takeaway that you have from this session, which is an overview of what happens when you create a group in the various different applications. So the model here is really, you'll notice on the top line, if I create a community team, group plan, team site group in these various apps, what am I going to get with that? So you can see with Yammer, you're going to get a Yammer feed. You're going to get that SharePoint online team site in the background. You're going to get a plan and planner, a portal in Stream, OneNote notebook, a couple other things. If I create a team, I'm going to get that Teams chat, place to have my channels, wikis associated with that, and actually the same back-end tools like SharePoint Online Planner, Stream, and whatnot in the background. If I create a group in Outlook, I'm going to get an Outlook inbox for the group. I'm going to get a shared calendar for the group, and I'm also going to get all of that other stuff that you saw earlier. The thing about Outlook that makes it a little bit different is actually you can create groups from other applications. That includes Planner, Stream, and SharePoint Online. SharePoint Online specifically if you create a team site. That is creating a group in the background, whether you know it or not. You will notice eventually that it does show up in Outlook, and that's because those groups are Outlook-based groups. So if you create a group in Outlook or Planner or Stream, you're going to get an Outlook group regardless. If you create one in Teams, a little bit different. If you create one in Yammer, a lot of bit different. We'll talk about that in a little bit. The other thing is you're going to be connecting to a lot of other applications out there. So if you look at the entire suite of applications that come with Office 365, almost all of these applications that you see here are going to be group enabled, right? So that could be, opening OneNote, Excel, Word, or PowerPoint files from SharePoint Online, sending a file via private chat and Teams. Would use OneDrive for Business to do that. Let's see, connecting to your tasks to do from Planner being a group connected app. Almost everything here has some sort of connection or inclusion into your Office 365 group. There are, certain applications like Dynamics, Power BI, Project that come with an additional fee or license for each user, but for the most part, a lot of these applications are going to have a connection directly to the Office 365 group, the Microsoft 365 group that you're using. So let's dive into each of the group types, and we're going to start with Outlook because groups really started with Outlook. If we look at the Outlook version of that infographic, you can see that you're going to get that inbox, that shared calendar, and Forms, OneNote, Planner, Power BI, SharePoint, and Stream information. Incidentally, if you go to that link that you see in the bottom left there, jum.to/groups, case sensitive, you'll notice a little bit of more information about how the Power BI connection is there. That's actually deprecating soon. The old school version of workspaces in Power BI are connected to groups. The new versions are not. So if you create a new group today, you will not have a group enabled connection to Power BI. If you have a group existing from months ago, it would potentially be connected to an earlier version of Power BI. So eventually this infographic will have to be updated for that reason. But when it comes to Outlook groups, it really brings together a number of different tools within one portal. The big two things are going to be first, email. That means that you have a shared email repository for when somebody sends email to the group can actually receive that email, or the group members can receive that email, or the group itself, that inbox that represents the group as a concept, can have a nice repository for all of the important messages that need to be saved. You could look at it from the perspective of, don't send all emails to the group because you may not want to use it as a distribution type of experience. You might want to use it as a repository type of experience. So you might go through back and forth with a vendor, 15, 20, 30 emails back and forth on how to negotiating a contract. But really the one that matters is the one that has a signed version of the contract from both sides. You can CC the group name. Now you have that important thing. Think of it as like file drawer for your important documents, not the ones that got you to the endpoint, but just the endpoint. The other big thing is going to be the calendar. That's the second important aspect of Outlook groups. A shared calendar where you can send an appointment to that group, and people within the group can actually have that appointment pop up on their calendars, take up their time, show them as being busy, include a Teams meeting, for example. And that's important because some of the other calendaring options for groups in the past have either been shared calendars or distribution calendars where it's a one-way street, or you have to log in separately, or it could be a SharePoint calendar, which doesn't really have any impact on your availability in Outlook. So this can actually solve some of those problems. I will say it's not perfect, and you do have to do a little research into what the impacts here are, but it's definitely a plausible option for if you're trying to have a nice central place for people to come to. And the other thing is going to be tabs. This will be sort of a theme among all three of the group types, whether you're in Outlook, Yammer, or Teams, is being able to add third-party apps. Outlook does it reasonably well. That being said, the portal that you're in, when you do open up a third-party app or tab here, generally it opens it up someplace else. It's going to go into a browser and open a new tab. So it doesn't really keep everything in one place. Not that that's terrible, but you just want to know what you're getting into. Getting access to all of your group's information and content is going to be, through this experience here. You see from a screenshot from Outlook, you can see you have mail, you have calendar, you have notebook, planner, site, the SharePoint site in the background, and the settings option if you're an owner. Now, one big topic that is actually very confusing, I think, is how to get people to receive emails that are sent to the group email address or to receive appointments that are sent to the group email address and actually take up their time in their calendar. There's actually a very specific setting you have to go into and enable when you create a group, and that is this checkbox here where it says members will receive all group conversations and events in their inboxes. They can stop following the group later if they want to. So impact here is very big, actually, because if you want to use the group as a distribution list where you send an email to just the group name and you expect every group member to get the email, you have to have this checked. But it also tells you that those people can actually disengage from the group and from the group email itself and not receive those emails. So they'd actually have to see it within the group and go to the group itself to see those emails. So keep that in mind. Later on, you can change this. It's not just something that you create or set at the very beginning. You can actually update it and change it later on through the group settings, which is shown on the right side. But this is sort of a big deal because it really does impact what the expectations are. A lot of people just see this as an upgraded distribution list, and by default, it's actually not. It's not meant to be that. It's meant to be more of a repository for messages and a place for central calendars and where you can actually place that calendar on top of yours and look at it as sort of a shared calendar. So the Outlook aspect is sort of similar to a lot of things that people have been using Outlook for the last 20 or more years. So there's not a whole lot to talk about there. Just now you have a connection to a place to keep your files in SharePoint Online. You have a place to do simple project management and planner. You have that OneNote notebook that comes with your SharePoint Online site. You can also add in as many other OneNotes as you would like. You have that stream portal for video if you want to host different videos in a permission protected area, all that kind of stuff. But let's move on to Teams. Teams is sort of the golden child of the Microsoft stack these days, especially since the impacts of COVID-19 have sent so many knowledge workers and office employees home and working from home for the first time in their lives. And Teams is really going to be a great place to get a lot of work done in one place without having to deal with email, without having to send messages or emails back and forth and deal with the notifications there. The overall view of how a team works is when you create a team in Microsoft Teams, you're going to get a team, a space to create channels, and each channel will have its own wiki, and then you'll get a form space, OneNote notebook, planner plan, Power BI workspace, SharePoint Online team site, and a stream video portal. Now, in the background, you're also actually going to get an Outlook inbox and an Outlook calendar for that group. It's not going to surface automatically. Until I think it was 2 years ago, Microsoft included the Outlook group with this, and it would actually show up in Outlook once you created a team. That is no more. Microsoft received enough complaints that they've actually changed up the system so that those the Outlook group is basically submerged and not available and visible to the everyday user. You can use PowerShell, a PowerShell commandlet to basically surface that so that the team can also have an Outlook group associated with it, which can be really helpful for dealing with external communication, maybe with a vendor or a partner or a customer, and at the same time have conversation internally within Microsoft Teams. Now, if you're not too familiar with Teams yet, although I'd be kind of surprised if you're not, at this point, it really combines a lot of the aspects of a bunch of different applications. So messaging and chat is basically replacing email and Skype. Files are being replaced in SharePoint and OneDrive, are actually being used by them in the background, but you may not know that if you're not savvy on the Microsoft stack. And even the community aspect of Yammer can be brought into Teams, whether it's Yammer itself or just the concept of knowledge sharing and other information like that. If you're not familiar with the user interface, this is what Microsoft Teams looks like. You can see a number of channels on the left side underneath that list of teams. Each team has an icon, and underneath the icon and the team name is going to be a list of the channels that you can create, which are basically arbitrary conversation spaces, similar to having like a folder structure within SharePoint or a shared drive. You choose or create these channels as you need them, which is incredibly, incredibly helpful. The reason this is great is because most people, when they complain about, I get too much email or we use email too much, there's a mixture of reasons why. Most common, people hate getting the responses, of email to 15 people and one person replies all and says, great, got it. Another one says, thanks. Another one responds with, okay, sounds good. And all of that is unnecessary. Those emails don't need to be sent to overtake your email inbox, but they still can be useful. Teams has the opportunity to basically provide reactions. So in the top right of a message, you can actually like it or put a heart on it, laugh at it, whatever option you want, which actually minimizes the number of notifications that you can get. The other thing is that the channels that you have within a team, you can decide to not follow them if you prefer not to. If there's something that's not really relevant to you, you don't have to get notifications about that conversation or about the topic unless somebody mentions you explicitly. And that's really helpful because that's where we get a lot of email that we don't care about, is projects or things that we're CC'd on that we really didn't need to know the information until 2 or 3 months down the road when the project is finally wrapping up or is done, which I think is a really big deal. Another thing is you're not going to get spam. I think in Outlook right now, presuming that your junk mail folder might let a few through here and there, every notification you get for an email is equal. Whether it's something really important from your boss telling you that you have to get something done by the end of the day, or a spam message saying, hey, sign up for this new service. Teams, you're not going to have that. And Teams has some seriously wide-ranging settings that you can set up for your notifications, which means that you can actually diminish or lower even the number of notifications you're getting otherwise. So really, really big deal in that case. Teams is also a central spot for your meetings now, whether they're within your team or if they're with other people, either internally at your organization or externally. Anybody with an email address can be invited to a Teams meeting. Huge deal there. They also can join without having to download a plugin or install the app. They can just join in a browser, which is huge. No major other, I think, meetings app can compete with that. Zoom, WebEx, GoToMeeting, none of them can do that. Maybe Google Hangouts or Google Meet, but that being said, Microsoft really played well on that one. So if you're interested in Microsoft Teams or you haven't looked at it much yet, there's a bunch of resources out there to take a look at. I actually have a nice central list of Teams resources. Again, these slides will be available after the session, so you can download this and get all of these links here and run with them later on. It's a great governance guide from a peer of mine, a couple peers of mine actually, in the MVP world that have done that. A list of etiquette that I put together, and a number of other things that actually we'll talk about a couple of these a little bit later. So Teams, for me, I'm actually a big Teams fanboy. I think it's really great. I haven't used email a lot in a long time because I don't really want to and don't have to. And the Teams experience is just really slick. It works really well both on desktop and on mobile, and it works on Mac OS, Windows, iOS, Android, totally worry-free when it comes to that. Now then we're going to talk about the third one and sort of the, I don't know, an Americanism here, but the redheaded stepchild of the group sphere, and that would be Yammer. Yammer has been something that a lot of people don't really fully understand. I really have an appreciation for Yammer, especially because all the time that I've spent as a knowledge management professional. Yammer has a lot of ability to build community and share information across an organization, especially a large one. When it comes to creating a Yammer community, you're going to get a feed. Looks very much like a social media feed, and it's going to be it's going to come along with that Forms, OneNote, Planner, Power BI, SharePoint, and Stream Video Portal. A little bit of history though, because a lot of people don't have the context of what Yammer is or where it came from. Yammer was a third-party tool back in 2008, and it had one major competitor. I think it was called NewsGator. At the time, it was really meant to be a plugin or an add-on to SharePoint 2010, there's SharePoint 2013, and in 2012, actually, Microsoft acquired it for more than $1 billion. Major investment, actually. So a lot, put into this. By 2017, we finally got groups integration because the concept of a Yammer community is really a group-based kind of thing, group little g based, and why not elevate that up to be a full-fledged citizen of the group experience, right? After that, we get a lot of questions. I hear people all the time say at conferences or whatnot asking, is Yammer dead? And the short answer to that is I'm going to say no. And that is for a number of reasons. One, Microsoft has put a ton of resources into Yammer since 2017 to make it fully full group citizen. But also, if you take a look at this tweet from, this is actually from SharePoint Conference 2019, so more than a year ago at this point, Mike Holste, who is one of the marketing managers for Yammer, pointed out some of these numbers, some major growth within Yammer, which shows that people are really using it. And I think that's a major reason to show that Yammer is not really going anywhere anytime soon, especially since this year has brought along a lot of Yammer upgrades and has been actually designated by Microsoft the Year of Yammer. If you listen to the Intrazone podcast, you may have heard that recently. If you don't listen to that podcast, it's a Microsoft podcast from the Microsoft 365 product marketing team. You probably want to check it out. But if we actually dive into what Yammer is, we're talking about an ESN, Enterprise Social Network. which effectively think of it like LinkedIn for work, and you might want to look at it that way. Your users, your colleagues might actually look at it more as like a Facebook for work, but it has a lot of use cases. So first, it's a lot about communication. It's bringing people together in a forum where they may not all know each other, but they can comment on, they can post, they can share information. They can either be in the all company area, they can be in small little groups off to the side. But the big thing I want to talk about here is going to be knowledge sharing. So knowledge sharing is a big one. Ideation, asking questions, finding out how to do the right thing, how to do something correctly or the right way, or the company or the organizational way. And Yammer is really great for that. So question and answers, think of this as being, Teams as being sort of the place to put your head down and get work done. And Yammer is the place where you pull out the megaphone in front of a large audience of colleagues and say, hey, does anybody know how to do this? That's what Q&A is great for. Being able to identify a best answer, so that now that the question has been asked and there's a best answer identified, later on when somebody's searching something similar, they'll be able to find that question and answer. And perhaps something has even changed, so they can reply to the comment or the thread and say, hey, does anybody have an update on this? I noticed something changed here. The connection directly to Microsoft Search, so you have files integration, connections to other applications within Office, and then actually you can bring in bots as a tool to answer questions that are common by using Q&A Maker, which is an Azure Cognitive Service, where you can basically seed a knowledge base with a bunch of different ways to ask a question, and then have the answer pre-written, vetted by whoever the subject matter expert is, linked to a source or resource that they can get to find out more information. The user experience, like I said, is very social media-like. It's going to remind you a lot of Facebook, especially the Facebook, like the iPad app or a tablet version of Facebook. But a big thing here to take away, and a lot of people stumble over this, is that Yammer and Teams are not the same thing. And it's not just about the brand, it's actually about the way that you use it. First, Yammer is about bigness. It is about organizations that have like-minded people that want to talk about similar things, but they may not know each other. So think of an organizational chart where each department has its own project management office. All of those PMs that work on project management across the organization probably don't know each other, but they should or do have a standard way of doing project management. Yammer is a great way for them to keep in contact with each other, ask questions, find out what best practices are, find out what the policies are, what is expected of them as a new employee, all of that kind of stuff. With Teams, it's more about who you know. It's your close-knit team, it's your business unit, and these are all generalities. They don't necessarily have to be this way. You can use Yammer in lieu of Teams in any organization or vice versa, but when it comes to trying to use both, especially if you're an organization of at least 200, 300, 400 people, when you get to that threshold of where there's a lot of people that you don't know at the organization, this is where you have a really good use case to have both of these things. Teams is much more, who you work with, task-based type of things, and great for actually going through and like getting stuff done. Yammer is more for, I wonder what's going on in the water cooler. Let's see what people are doing. Let's see what people are asking about. Use cases for Yammer, this is sort of the big one that people always ask about. I think the big thing is going to be communities of practice and user groups. That's going to be something for like the project management teams or project managers within a large organization. That would be a community of practice. Another would be developers, right? Another could be of the accounting teams across different organizations. User groups are also big. So SharePoint or Office 365 or Teams user groups, there's always an Excel user group, and they're always the most helpful people in the world because Excel users or Excel power users are just, they love Excel and they love learning new things about Excel. And if you want to get a Yammer group or a Yammer off the ground, you want to show a success story, definitely go forward with that. A lot of great opportunity there. It's also really good for affinity groups. So this is a great place to show company culture. Think of it like, an organization I used to work in had both Society of Women Engineers, had the Nuclear Society of America, a couple other, let's say American Society of Mechanical Engineers, ASME, like those kind of affinity groups, those local chapters can have a really good opportunity to keep themselves oriented and together and be able to do things like that. Another example here could be for the softball league or the soccer or football league, being able to keep in contact with each other, especially in a large organization, that might make sense. The different buildings or sites can also have representation, be sending messages specifically to the site that, some party is going on there, let everybody know that that's happening, and that's a lot of good opportunity. Microsoft also pushes really hard on internal communications. I don't love this as much as I like the other ones because internal communications can be done in very many different ways. That can be sent via blast email. That could be on the news in your SharePoint intranet. The CEO connection is pretty much the same thing, but they like to split those out. New hires, though, is a really nice one. I think that's a great place for people to interact. That can be a little hard to define, though, because how long are you considered a new hire and how useful is that information for you after you become one? I think, I've always been a strong advocate of pushing new hire information onto a central website internally on the intranet. But you could definitely have one of those SharePoint sites where you have that, and then Yammer feed, because there is a web part in SharePoint where you can drop a Yammer feed and people can see the feed without even having to go to Yammer. Another connection between Yammer and Teams is that Yammer is now available as an app in Teams. So on the left app bar in Microsoft Teams, where you have notifications, chat, Teams, calendar, you can also add something called Communities, and that is the term Teams uses for the Yammer app in Teams, and that brings Yammer basically right into Microsoft Teams, so you don't have to leave that hub for work. Another thing is that both Teams and Yammer support the live events tool, which is basically built on top of Microsoft Stream, so you're able to do things like webinars or town hall meetings, large audience, or few to many type of presentations where you have a couple different presenters and potentially hundreds, maybe even thousands. I think the live events have gone from, I think they had 10,000 potential attendees up to 20,000, but you can stream these things directly through Yammer, or schedule them through Yammer, schedule them through Teams, and stream them through there as well. So a couple nice connections there. One thing I do want to clear up here, though, is the connections between Yammer, Teams, and Outlook. So I did mention that if you create an Outlook group, you can potentially connect some other things. One of those things is you can actually make it a team. So you can go into the SharePoint site that was associated with that Outlook group and teamify it for the unofficial term there. There usually is a link on the bottom left side of that Microsoft or that SharePoint Online team site where it says add a Microsoft team. With Teams, I mentioned that there is an Outlook group associated with that team. It just is not surfaced automatically. You actually have to run a commandlet in PowerShell to do that. So somebody in IT has to be able to set that up for them. But the one outlier is really Yammer. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that it was an external acquisition, that the guts of Yammer don't necessarily jive very well with Outlook or with Azure Active Directory or Teams the way that the homegrown versions or the homegrown apps like Teams and Outlook are able to. So if you decide to go forward with Yammer, you're kind of stuck with Yammer. If people start using it, they upload a lot of files, they start using the planner plan. There is no migration option to say, never mind, we don't like Yammer, we want to move over to Teams. There are options for going back and forth between, say, Outlook and Teams, but there's not a whole lot that you can do between Teams and Yammer or Outlook and Yammer. So I think that's kind of a big takeaway here and one to keep in mind. Now, when it comes to the resources for Yammer, there's a lot of stuff out there, especially this year because of the Year of Yammer updates, the entirely updated UI. It actually looks very, very nice. Very impressed with the design team at Microsoft who have updated a lot here. But you want to keep an eye out on the new Yammer. The new Yammer, which I mentioned here for the preview, is actually, I think, GA as of generally available as of this week, I think. But definitely keep an eye out on the roadmap. And I have a couple resources which I'll actually bring up a little bit later as well on what to use when. When should I use Teams? When should I use Yammer? I've been kind of talking through when I would use either, but I've put together a number of blog posts on Teams or Outlook, Yammer or Teams, things like that. And I think also the use case examples are important. There's actually a good blog post from the product marketing team that went through 100 different use case examples for Yammer. And sometimes people need some use case examples to be inspired on how to make the most of Yammer, or even to give them the oomph to go into Yammer and start using it. And sometimes it's not very obvious, but why reinvent that wheel? Why develop creativity for that when you can just grab some things that some other people have done? So that is effectively Microsoft 365 groups sort of in a nutshell. This has been sort of fast and a quick overview of it, but really the whole concept here is bringing people together, having a central membership group behind the scenes to allow you to have safe access to an online workspace, either through Outlook, through Teams, or through Yammer. The beauty of this really is that you can add and remove people as necessary. The new people now have access to all the old information that has been there before them, and they can take part moving forward. And when you remove somebody, they no longer have access to any of that information. That's really powerful. Think about when somebody starts in your organization and they're brand new and they get swamped by 15 different people in their organization with a bunch of emails they get forwarded for context and some information about work that they're doing. And all of those emails are going to be through the viewpoint or through the lenses of the people sending those emails. So whatever's important to them, it's their view of the world. Well, that new person deserves to have a view of the world that's a bit wider than that, right? So being able to provide them access to all of this information directly is really, really powerful and a huge deal within Office 365 and Microsoft 365. Now, there are some central resources that I want to point you to here today. First would be the slides. If you want to grab these, you can get them from my website, or you can grab them also from the conference resources. A number of different infographics and blog posts that I think could be very helpful. Like I mentioned, should I use Yammer or Teams? Should I use Teams or Outlook? The groups infographic that I mentioned a number of times through this session is available there as well. I blog on a regular basis about things. I generally stick to a lot of things on Microsoft Teams these days, but also the general level of Office 365, Microsoft 365. If you're new to Teams and you want to find a nice way to kind of have a little compact with your colleagues, your peers, your fellow students, the etiquette guide that I put together is a nice little ebook. Actually, it's a printed version as well. Gives you a number of different steps to follow on how to be a good Teams user, both or throughout the entire experience, whether you're in conversations in a channel itself, files, private channels, private chat, bots and apps, meetings and calls, things like that. And then another big one here is going to be an infographic I put together on how to stay up to date with Office 365 and all the changes that occur within it. Changes happen all the time, so if you want to check, get a list of places that you should really check out and follow, you definitely want to check out this infographic here, the Staying Up to Date with Office 365 infographic. Part of this is actually going to be a list, a table of resources that are separated by app. So you'll find a link to the official blog, the official roadmap, the official feedback submission community or forum, and then the official community forum for each of the apps, in addition to the Twitter feed or Twitter handle of those apps, and a number of important or notable Microsoft people who work on that product. So some things you'll actually notice don't even have a roadmap or an official blog, but pretty much everything has a feedback submission, whether it's user voice or if it's the ideas forum for the Power Platform. And then pretty much all of them or most of them have an official Twitter account, or at least somebody who's important there. So with that, I'm going to wrap up here. One thing I wanted to remind you of is being able to contact me. So you can follow me on Twitter. You can connect with me on LinkedIn. I connect with anybody. Feel free to hit me up there. You can follow me on my blog. And if you have any questions or you want any sort of training or any sort of, other, I don't know, you just have a question or you just, have a confusion point that you're trying to get through or a debate point that you've been working through with your team, by all means, send me an email at the email that you see listed there. And another thing is, if you have the time, please provide some feedback on this session. Actually, if you hold up your iOS or your Android phone right now and you open up the camera and you hold it up to your screen, the QR code that you see here should automatically open up a link on your phone and you can provide some feedback there. So with that, I'm seeing no questions on the live event. And I want to just say thank you again to ComSource for having me for this and for a previous session that I did yesterday. This has been a really great event. A lot of impressive turnout and sponsorship turnout. And I hope the rest of the session is going to be great for you. And again, if you have questions or if you're more interested in some more Office 365 or Microsoft 365, either groups or not groups information, you can feel free to reach out to me. So thanks very much. And Mark, I'll pass it back to you to close out the session.
All right. Thank you very much, Matt. If you'd like to chat with Matt offline or in his breakout, then you can join a meeting right now. I pasted a link in the announcement section. And thank you very much for watching. Thank you to Matt. It's been a great session, and we'll see you in the next one.